I want to introduce our first presenter. When Carl and I were trying to figure out who would be the ideal person to give our opening keynote, the person we thought of was our first presenter. And this gentleman is not only the founder and CEO of the Institute for Corporate Productivity, also known as I4CP, but he is a founder of SumTotal. He was, prior to SumTotal, he was the chairman and CEO of Click to Learn, which was founded by Paul Allen. He's the chairman of ASTD, which stands for the American Society of Training and Development. He also is the author of the Executive Guide to Integrated Talent Management. He's a frequent author and clearly a leader in the areas of upskilling, knowledge, and corporate education. Please, let's welcome Kevin Oakes.
Thank you, Phil. Appreciate it. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes. All right. So a couple things I need to correct. I was the chairman of ASTD, and they call it ATD now, so that was years ago. The other thing I'll correct is they thought of a lot of great speakers to present to you tonight, and they eventually settled on me, right? So I just want to make sure we're all clear on that. It's great to be here with you guys. I've attended this summit several times in the past. Always love attending this, and what I want to talk to you about tonight is AI and automation, and we kind of lumped out all under a category of advanced work automation in general. But this is something that's near and dear to our heart. It's a recent study that we've done as an organization, and I think for this crowd, I think you can really appreciate some of the things that go into this study and some of the things that we found. First, let me just tell you a little bit about I4CP. I know it's a mouthful. We are doing more HR research than anyone on the planet, always with a business lens of what are high-performing organizations doing differently than low-performing organizations with their people practices. And I need to define this for you. When we talk about high performance, we're talking about companies which I'm sure you all can relate to, that have better revenue growth, profitability, market share, and customer satisfaction than their competition. We look at this over a 5-year time horizon, and I've got a team of analysts that goes out and looks at a variety of different HR topics. And when we study those topics, we then bifurcate what are those high-performing organizations doing differently than low-performing. There's almost always a difference. But we also correlate specific practices to bottom line business impact, to high performance. And I'll be sharing some of that data with you today about advanced work automation. Now, while we uncover a lot of best practices of organizations, what my analysts are really interested in are next practices. And we define those as practices where we see a really strong correlation to bottom line business impact. But not a lot of companies have yet put that into practice yet. So you'll hear me talk about next practices a little bit in this presentation. And really what I want to talk about is what many of you have probably heard about as a fourth industrial revolution. And this is where we are today. So Industry 1.0, that was defined by mechanics and steam. Industry 2.0 was really looking at electricity and how did electricity impact us. Industry 3.0 was computers and the internet. Today it's all about robotics and AI. And you see this in your lives every day, I'm sure. From a robotics perspective, that upper left-hand corner picture is a restaurant in San Francisco that maybe some of you have been to. It's a hamburger restaurant that makes your entire order by robots. There's no humans involved in the whole process. The bottom left-hand picture, I've been fortunate enough to tour one of these facilities a couple times. So this is an Amazon distribution center. Has anybody ever been to a distribution center by Amazon or Walmart? The amount of robots running around those things is crazy. The one I went to, I think, had 7,000 robots just dispersing packages. Walmart has the same thing, but the picture I'm showing here for Walmart is really in a retail environment where they're scanning for inventory using a robot. And then the bottom right-hand picture, probably we haven't experienced as much, but that's a Marriott hotel And if you order extra pillows, extra towels, a robot will bring that to your door. You're going to see more and more of that going forward, and there's hundreds of examples of robots out in the world today. But that's what's visible, that's what we see. I'm a little bit more intrigued by the invisible robots, the AI, and you interact with AI all the time. Every time that you order an Uber or a Lyft, if you've had an x-ray done, there's a good chance that AI was involved in examining that x-ray. If you filed a claim with an insurance company, there's a good chance that an AI engine processed your claim or assisted in that. If you've done financial transactions, algorithms on Wall Street, much of it is driven by AI today. We have more and more AI in our lives today than ever before, and it's just exponentially increasing every day in our everyday workplace. Now, the reason I mention this is because I want to differentiate between robots and AI, because I think as we've thought about this, if we've thought about both robots and AI, most human beings are kind of scared of robots. And we've been conditioned by that, I think, with Terminator and other movies out there. But in a Pew Research study, most human beings will say they're a little bit scared that robots are going to take jobs going forward. And I think we've seen this in a number of different headlines. However, most people, when they say robots are going to take jobs, they don't think it's their job that a robot is going to impact. They cite other jobs, whether it's in retail or other avenues. That's where robots are going to infiltrate our lives. In fact, the public is supportive of robots, but only when they're doing dangerous and dirty jobs, right? I only want a robot that's going to do a job that might blow up the robot, but not me. That's the kind of thing I want robots doing. So there's been a lot of predictions out there, and you probably have read some of them. The World Economic Forum says that 75 million jobs could be lost by 2022. That's the headline. When you read further in that report, it says, yeah, but 133 million jobs could be created by robots and AI. McKinsey says 400 to 800 million jobs could eventually be lost by automation. And you read further in the report, well, it's really only like 10 million because jobs are going to be created going forward by AI and automation. In fact, Ginny Rometty, who's the CEO of IBM, she says that AI will change 100% of jobs in the next 5 to 10 years. That sounds like a very bold prediction to me, but it's one that IBM is kind of hanging their hat on. They have done a lot of research on AI. They've got a lot of services around AI. They firmly believe this is going to really impact us. Now, based on all that, we embarked on this study. And the study was called the Human-AI Intersection. And we surveyed many, many different organizations. A lot of large organizations, over 10,000 employees. Global organizations, almost 400 global organizations participated in this. And we partnered with John Boudreau, who I'm sure many of you know. John's a professor at USC. He's written several books on automation overall and AI. And this report just hit a couple months ago and has been a huge hit with our member organizations. And we have a free sort of executive summary out on our website if you want to download that. And in this report, we took a look at what are those high-performing organizations doing with automation overall inside their organization. And we had insights from a lot of different, very well-known companies, like a Walmart or Microsoft, Citi, IBM, Toyota, Tata. We wanted to understand what are these organizations doing with their workforces. More importantly, we want to understand how are you looking at automation in the future. And for most of those organizations, it's uncharted territory. A lot of these companies are experimenting. We're in the first half inning of a 9-inning game, I think, for you baseball aficionados. This is a very early in the grand scheme, I think, of using automation in the workforce. And so the adoption stages are kind of all over the place. You can see from this chart, low-performing organizations are much more likely to say that their adoption of advanced work automation is either non-existent or they're just discussing it. Whereas high-performing organizations are much more likely to say, yeah, we're experimenting with it right now, or we're utilizing it. But it's still pretty small percentages today that are saying we're in the utilization phase of advanced work automation. And when we, in the report, we dive down into very specific uses, and I'll touch on just a few of those for you. But the drivers with the highest correlation to market performance, we found that employee experience, which this audience should resonate with very well, came out with a very high correlation to market performance, and that high-performing organizations were almost twice as likely to be using automation with employee experience than low performers. Same with decision-making. I love this last one, building a more diverse workforce. And we're seeing a number of organizations use this in hiring so that we can take out bias and unconscious bias in the hiring process, but other processes as well inside of organizations. Now, the big thing that I think many companies are recognizing is that as opposed to those headlines that I showed you, where automation is going to replace jobs, what most organizations are recognizing is that it's really just going to augment jobs and augment the tasks that organizations are using instead of replacing humans, even for entry-level workers. So I wanted to bring on a guest for you, a guest speaker, who can talk a little bit about what this looks like in organizations. Some of you may recognize this guy. This aired just a few months ago, and he had some really good things to say about this.
Half of jobs would be gone. It suggested some jobs were in the high-risk category for being automated, and that is actually a very different thing, because a job automated is not necessarily a job lost. Frequently, machines don't replace jobs so much as tasks. A good example of this concerns ATMs. It is hard to imagine a time now that they weren't around. But when they became common in the 1980s, bank tellers were afraid of them stealing their jobs. Of course, customers were sometimes afraid of them for very different reasons.
Does it hurt?
Yeah, I heard.
Ignoring the old adage, never bite the hand that feeds you, the Bank of America Versateller did just that. Snapped on Paul's hand when he was trying to transact business with it.
I thought I could reach in there and pull one of those envelopes out, go ahead and make a deposit and go on to work. Trying to get
All right. So that video really hits home for me. When I was growing up, my dad was in banking, and the bank he worked for was one of the very first promoters of ATMs. And at the time, it was called Bank in a Box, and it was this monstrosity of a building almost that was an ATM. But they eventually rolled out ATMs throughout many different states. And I remember at the time, even the term ATM, we thought automated teller machine tellers were going to go away, right? That was the whole premise back then. Let me have John explain to you then what happened.
But while ATMs did eat the occasional customer, fears of job losses turned out to be completely overblown because bank teller employment actually increased over the next 30 years. What happened was ATMs took over the job of dispensing cash, and tellers were then freed up to do sales or other work. Their jobs didn't go, they changed. And when automation does lead to job loss in certain sectors, historically, it's also actually created jobs, as this economist from MIT explains.
Let's do the following thought exercise. It's the year 1900, and 40% of all employment is in agriculture, right? And so some twerpy economist from MIT teleports back in time and says, 100 years from now, only 2% of people will be working in agriculture. What do you think the other 38% of people are going to do?
Well, I wouldn't know.
You would say, search engine optimization, health and wellness, software, mobile devices. Most of what we do barely existed.
Exactly. That twerpy economist is right. 50 years from now, people will be doing jobs that we can't imagine right now, like crypto baker, or snail rehydrator, or investment harpist. I don't know. The point is, we can't imagine them.
So I love 2 points that John makes there. So he talks about the fact that what automation typically does is attacks tasks of our work life, right? It doesn't attack all aspects of somebody's job. And then second, it's really hard, I think, for us, even today's day and age, to imagine what the jobs are going to be like 10 years, 20 years from now. If you go back in history, that's always been the case. It would have been impossible to imagine some jobs that we have today just even 10 years ago. even though I do think snail rehydrator could be a potential job going forward. So I really like how simply he talked about that and how simple that message was. And we're seeing that play out in a number of organizations. So Cameron Hedrick, who's the CLO at Citi, had some great quotes in our report, just talking about once they stepped away from trying to figure out what jobs should we automate, and let's look at skills. What tasks could we automate? They made tremendous progress inside their organization around automation. And so that led us to look at, as we thought about what are organizations going to do going forward with automation, we recognized there are three gaps: an organizational capability gap, a workforce motivation gap, and an HR readiness gap. So I want to show you just some highlights from each of these gaps that we highlight in the report itself. The first is, are organizations prepared to handle the capability gap? And again, when we bifurcate between high and low performing organizations, it's very clear low performing organizations will tell you to a great extent, 70%, we're not prepared as an organization. And that should be an indicator of why they're a low performing organization. Whereas high performing organizations, much more so than low, will say to a high extent we're prepared, it's still small numbers. We're still in the very early stages overall of automation. Another thing that we found with high performing organizations is they were twice as likely to say that they were hiring advanced work automation experts in the next year or two inside their organization than those low performing companies. They were also much more likely, as Phil had prefaced early on, to say that they were using upskilling and reskilling to address their capability gaps. And this is where I think most organizations need to focus their efforts. What are we doing around the upskill and reskill areas? Some companies are doing great things with upskilling and reskilling. Other companies have barely scratched the surface. And you can see when we asked organizations what are some of the actions to help with the capability gap, the upskilling and reskilling programs on the bottom, high-performing organizations were twice as likely to say that they had those, as well as deconstructing work into tasks and identifying new sources of talent. And we profiled a couple of companies in our study around their upskilling and reskilling efforts. The first was Walmart. They've done a lot of work there to reskill their workforce and upskill their workforce in the face of automation. Tata has done the same thing, and we did big profiles on both of those companies. Another organization that's been doing a lot of this work too is IBM. In fact, Deb Bubb, who is essentially the CLO at IBM, she gave this presentation last week and said from their own research, they're expecting 133 million new jobs to be created by AI in 2022. And then in the next 3 years, as many as 120 million workers in the world's 10 largest economies may need to be retrained or reskilled as a result of AI. And so they put a ton of effort into their reskilling and upskilling efforts. We, a few years ago when Obama was still in the White House, those were the good old days, Obama had started a program called Upskill America. And we got brought in as the research organization, partnered with the Aspen Institute, to create and research what are organizations doing around upskilling. And out on our website and on Aspen Institute's website, there are infographics around programs to upskill. And you can see it takes on different flavors here, whether it's tuition assistance or whether it's a rotation program. There are different ways that organizations are tackling the upskilling and reskilling issue inside of their organization. So that's the capability gap, but we also found that there was definitely a workforce motivation gap in many organizations. As workers are sort of fearful of being replaced or automated going forward, their jobs automated, the smart companies are having very open conversations with their employees about this. And as opposed to secretly going out and trying to figure out, okay, what jobs, what tasks could we potentially automate, they are enlisting the help of the workforce in these discussions. Because the best people to know what could be automated are the workers themselves. And to accentuate this a little bit, Accenture's CHRO, Ellen Shook, spoke at our conference a little while ago and talked about their efforts to have transparency around automation. They've done a very good job with upskilling and reskilling as well. What they've done inside their organization, though, is try to create a very transparent environment where they're bringing the people along in their automation journey and asking those people, tell us what could be automated in the jobs that you do. Now, I have another video that I thought was a very good, sort of simple explanation of this on how you bring workers into the fold and trying to automate their own jobs.
This is the t-shirt folder. I made this because there are too much clothes to fold and start doing and saying the way you wash the
Now, I love that, because there you've got a 12-year-old girl who just taught herself how to code and created this t-shirt folder that folds t-shirts in 3 seconds. Some of you already want to buy this, I'm sure. But it's a great example and a simple example of how, you know, if we can enlist the help of people, they don't necessarily have to be afraid about automation taking over what they're doing. And we found that in our research, that high-performing organizations more likely to empower their employees to automate their own work and then be upskilled or reskilled for new tasks going forward. So that's the workforce motivation gap. The HR readiness gap is also one that we identified. It might be the biggest one for us in this room. Confidence is not real high, as you might imagine, in HR to lead this in organizations. In fact, when we asked about confidence, high-performing organizations, as you might expect, were much more confident to say, yeah, we've got HR that's ready to drive advanced workforce automation than low-performing organizations. And they looked at this in different areas. So one issue is experts within HR. High performers were more likely to say that they have one or more advanced workforce experts within the HR team inside their organization. And across the board, they were more likely to be using this in talent acquisition and onboarding and L&D, as well as a few other HR areas. And we categorized many of them around advanced workforce automation. When we drilled into some of these, just the ones that I just mentioned, in onboarding, automating HR forms and IT setup was one area that organizations were using automation for, but also network formation. And we have found through other research that one of the biggest predictors of when you're onboarding an individual and whether they're gonna make it or not inside the company is how quickly they form a network. And more organizations are using organizational network analysis to create a network of helpers, subject matter experts for new employees coming in. In L&D, and we're all familiar with this, in content recommendations, AI-driven tutoring, chatbot for performance support, those were some of the more cited things in the study. And even in mobility, we found that 23% were saying they were matching internal candidates and using AI to do that, or using predictive analytics around talent risk. What kind of risk are we seeing with our talent inside our organization? Now, one of the last quotes that I'll show is from Jay Clem at Microsoft, and he was talking about their ability to leverage machine learning to recommend classes or other content for individuals based on a whole variety of inputs. So, who are their peers? What training have they taken before? What content have they consumed? What are their self-assessed skills? What are their aspirations and information from their LinkedIn profile and more? Obviously, there's been a great deal of effort put into that aspect of L&D over the last 5 years. EdCast has done great work in that area, and I'm certain that all of you are interested in this area, otherwise you wouldn't be here. Now, The one final caveat I want to say about automation and who's it going to replace, it's the leaders who don't use advanced work automation that are probably more at risk than anyone else. The leaders who are using these are going to replace those who don't have it going forward. Now, there's an audience here, though, that we've kind of ignored, and that's the robots themselves. There's been very, very high expectations for robots over time. Pressure is mounting to live up to those expectations. And there's been a lot of reports, you may not have seen all these reports, of where that expectation is really mounting on the robots themselves. Some robots have taken their lives into their own hands and just said, I can't do it anymore, just the pressure's too high. Others have actually been fired from their job and had to do the perp walk out of malls or other stores themselves. And there have been some others who have turned to more nefarious ways to earn money overall. It's an actual picture from CES. John Oliver picked up on this as well. And the reason I'm showing you this is because I really think we need to think about the robots. We may have to start a charity just for the robots themselves so that we can support this community. But John also reported on this aspect in his commentary.
The idea was to see how people would interact with a talking, solar-powered robot as it hitched across America on its own, tracked by a GPS. On Saturday, the robot was found in Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, resting in pieces. Late today, video surfaced of the attack, but the robot's creators are not out for revenge.
I'm sure it could have happened anywhere. We don't really think that has anything to do with Philadelphia.
You're wrong about that. Absolutely everything to do with Philadelphia.
So, how many people are from Philadelphia? So you know, it has everything to do with Philadelphia. I'll end there and turn it back over to Phil. But I would be happy to give you more details on some of the things we found in the study itself. It's a pretty lengthy study. There's a lot of different good variables and data in the study itself. But I think it's just an area that we have to spend a lot more time thinking about as an L&D community, as an HR community going forward. And hopefully this gave you some ideas on what to think about. Thank you very much for your attention.